And our broadcast, just for clarity for Beth and Charlie, we have no audience in the room at the moment, but see if that changes. But
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Andy.
okay, we are live.
Okay, this is the planning board meeting for May 1st, 2024. I'll begin by calling the roll. Alden Clark is not here. Beth Delisle.
Here.
Bob Coe. Here. Jamie Pennington.
Here.
Heather Rogers will not be here. Charlie Palmisano.
Present.
Brian Belton.
And he is actually coming in as a panelist now. So Brian, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great.
And Rick Taylor is here. So we have a quorum. And we have no applications before us tonight. And we do not have minutes. We'll have the minutes for the April 27th meeting at our next meeting. So really the sole thing on the agenda is the primary thing on the agenda is to talk about the MBTA zoning and discuss where we are and also look at the types of standards and design standards, dimensional standards, etc. Things we should be thinking about as we accommodate development, particularly moving down Parker Street.
Mm-hmm.
And I prepared do you have anything that you wanted to add to this?
No, I'll just chime in as we go if there's anything. Yeah,
So
no.
I have a presentation that Andy now has up on the screen that I'm just going to go through and sort of as a conversation starter. So if you recall, on the 17th, we agreed on what I've called here the planning board consensus plan on the left, which would result in somewhere between, we estimated between 1,300 and 1,450 unit capacity for MBTA zoning. The next day, after our meeting, the zoning advisory group met and came up with a somewhat different one. Instead of doing the Empro Low Street site that we had looked at, the ZAG consensus was to add a couple more parcels on Parker Street, which would get us almost to the same number of units in terms of unit capacity as our planning board plan. So with these two, they're quite similar. I guess the big difference is that two big differences. One is that by concentrating on Parker Street, we get more of the benefit of using the existing 25% affordability requirement that we have in the existing 40R district, which would not be available on the Empro Low Street site. And the other part is that we could basically just make some small adjustments to the existing smart growth district, whereas going into the Empro Low site would require some more thought in terms of development standards and so forth. So those are the differences. And as I understand it, right, I do understand it, that these two options were presented to the city council on Monday night. And they referred it to the Planning and Development Committee, which will be
Next Tuesday.
Planning and Development Committee. So there'll be a recommendation coming from them back to the council, and then the council hopefully will make a decision on which direction, if either of these they want to go. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, that's a great summary. I would also note, and I did reach out to Councilor Shan. I don't know if I didn't check. She might have responded. I don't think she had a chance yet, but I did suggest that if she wanted to, as committee chair, just remind the other councilors who hadn't participated necessarily to date, all of them in the subcommittee meetings, that we touched on this as we went, that ideally, as many of the 11 councilors would show up to the subcommittee meeting. That way, even before we get back to the full council with the committee report, this is being, an important discussion, that ideally, because they posted that as committee of the whole, the entire council would, hopefully, we're not going to get everybody, but hopefully a good, majority of the council would be there, so we could make sure it's not just the 3 members of that subcommittee. Because remember that a subcommittee is only 3 of the 11 councilors, and given it's a zoning matter of 2/3 vote, or depending, depending on the nature. Bottom line, I guess, is it's good for us to have input from all. So hopefully we'll have more than just the 3 committee members there with the council next Tuesday.
Okay. If you have any questions about these maps or where we stand with the city council at this point?
So I guess my comment is, with our consensus plan, the Enpro, including the Enpro site, might warrant or does warrant us having to tweak some of the zoning for that particular site. Is that correct?
Yeah, we would actually have to create a new zoning district for that area, a new overlay district. Yeah, right now, if you recall, the smart growth district has two sub-districts, essentially a 40 unit per acre major part of the district and the 30 unit per acre. And so adding Hines Way and Parker Street just lets us maybe expand the 30 unit per acre district, or maybe have a third sub-district. But it's just minor tweaking. Whereas going to MPRO would really, I mean, it wouldn't be a huge task, because we could base it on the 40R, but we'd certainly have to make some more significant changes for the from the zoning that's there right now, creating the zoning district.
And the reasoning behind the ZAG consensus plan was that they thought it was just easier to implement, or I didn't quite.
Oh, two things. It's easier to implement. It's the first one. And the second is that in the 40R district right now, we have the ability to require developments to have 25% of their units as affordable units. If we go outside the 40R district, we immediately drop down to a default of 10% instead of 25%, with the opportunity, if we could justify it, to move up perhaps to 20%. So basically, expanding the 40R district gives us more potential for affordable units or subsidized units than creating a new district.
If I could.
Yeah,
If I could add, just one other consideration. So I know updated my memo to the council. There was a request that I updated the memo that I gave to the council. And one other point that I noted in there, that again, it's up to the council at this point, but one other consideration I think is worthwhile is, while I'm in favor of the streamlining of permitting for appropriate uses, in this case, the residential, that because the MPRO site is closer up to, say, High Street, where it comes down with Cary Ave, and it's so close to the rail trail and so forth, that the board, essentially at the end of the day, because this board presumably is going to be involved in the permitting process, that this board might still want to retain a little bit more of the discretionary control over what's happening in a location like that than, say, by comparison, depending on what your perspective is, whether, an additional piece of what we've already seen on the Parker Street, Boston Way area, sort of weighing those two in comparison, it might be that part of that, concern was retaining a little bit more of that authority in that location. Whereas with MBTA communities, you might have less leverage essentially when it comes to design standards and review with a developer, because of the way that the regulations and the boxes or the guardrails are on there to prevent things from getting out of control in terms of how difficult the permitting process is for folks. So our design standards, our permitting review would be examined essentially by the state before approved, versus here you have the latitude to do as much as you normally do with zoning and permitting. So anyway.
Thanks.
Good answer.
Yeah, good answer. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on then. Next slide. So I guess one thing, just thinking about this, the character of this area. So right now we have kind of low buildings set way back from the street, no sense of enclosure at all. It's typical Newburyport business park character, and also no pedestrian or bicycle accommodations at all. So it's not a current character that is really a suburban office park kind of character. And part of what we should be thinking about, I think, I guess a lot of this is, again, I'll say we should be thinking about it. This is my opinion, so you can feel free to raise alternate ideas. But I think we should be thinking about how new 3-story buildings should fit into this corridor. Okay, next slide. So we're basically looking at really 4 parcels. Even the 5th parcel on the lower left is a parcel, but it's got a stream, it's got wetlands. It's very likely not to be much developable at all. So we're really talking about 4 distinct parcels. And this particular image, I think, is helpful because it shows 1 Boston Way on the right. And I'll get back to that in a second, but this is the kind of development that you've seen at 1 Boston Way, 3 Boston Way. We're going to see at whatever 180 to 200 Route 1, whatever the address is. And so it's basically a model that Minko is using to fit into our current ordinance. And so we should be thinking about how this, whether we want this to be replicated down the street, or whether we want something different. Next one.
Yeah, and sorry, and I 100% agree with Rick's points here and where all this is going, including the streetscape improvements, which has actually come up in this section before, the bikeway, connections and so forth. We actually wanted to, when this bike path connection was put in with some state monies and some of Boston Ways improvements, we wanted to extend it further, but we had the discussion about, cost and who does it. And so we wanted to implement this in phases. But I think it's also worth noting that the one little oddity that we had in the case of the Boston Waste site was they had this National Grid easement going through here, which precluded their ability. So here we have this, I think to Rick's point, right? We have a very long building on that site.
And so here we are with the aerial view. And one thing about our current zoning is it has a 10-foot maximum front yard setback.
Right.
And we do have the ability to waive things. And I know that One Boston Way got a number of waivers. I wasn't on the board then, so I don't know what the extent of those waivers were.
Yeah.
But it's clear if you look at the property line along Parker Street, the yellow line there, you can see that looking at One Boston Way, if the building is very close to that property line. So that probably does meet, I guess that meets the 10-foot setback there. On the Boston Way side, it's set back a little bit further, and I think that had to do with drainage, if I recall.
That's my recollection, yeah.
There was a waiver there for the drainage. So, to zoom back out again, then one of the things we're gonna need to think about is whether we can get the right kind of everything we want from a development with that maximum 10-foot setback, or whether there's some other things we should be looking at. So the next slide. So right now, these are the approximate setbacks that I've measured from the GIS. So right now we're at, 180, 110, 70, 50. Clearly we don't, get my opinion, but clearly we don't want that for this kind of area if we want to create a sense of enclosure in the street and a pedestrian orientation. But we want something that's different than what's there right now. And everybody, please feel free to interrupt me.
Well, yeah, it's funny, Rick. I was actually just thinking that. So I understand this. You would like to see more, let's just call it urbanized development along Parker Street, whereby the buildings would be closer to the road, and then there would be sidewalks and pedestrian access, things of that nature. Is that what you're talking about?
And also not having the buildings separated from the street by parking lots.
Okay.
That's a big thing too, to make it more pedestrian friendly.
Yeah. And then obviously increasing the corridor of accessibility from Parker Street to, is that Scotland Road? I forget the name. That's Scotland Road, right?
Yes,
Graph. And then up to the school, which go close to Low Street, right?
Yeah.
And the new pickleball court at Chris Webb's place.
Before we get to like what we might want to see,
right.
ideally, I just want to make sure I understand the parameters of the MBTA. So is my understanding correct that basically to get to the capacity analysis, they use the 40R zoning setback? So
well, we're gonna get there.
you're going to get there. Okay.
I'm gonna get there because I think that if we start moving, that's one of my last slides, I think. If we start moving the front yard back, then that reduces the building envelope, right? So it might reduce the unit capacity slightly. Is that what you were thinking about?
Yeah, that's where we're headed here, right? Potentially. How far could, I mean, again, I know this is not about the character, you're talking about character, and that's important, but just like to understand where this might be going. Could you change it much at all before you have to add more parcels?
I don't, well, because if we look at the ZAG plan has a range somewhere between 1,241 and 1,360 units. We need 1,292. So we might actually have the flexibility in there to do that. The other thing we could think about is increase the density, because we asked for that capacity to be calculated at 30 units per acre. So we could, for example, make that building that's across from One Boston Way, make that an extension of the 40 units per acre, get some more capacity there. So we can play around with these density.
Right.
But something we're gonna have to think about as we refine this. Yeah.
If I could, and I'm thinking about the same sort of, lens of issues, right? One thing I just wanted to know is, so the existing 40R district does call for essentially, or does specify the buildings are supposed to be brought up to the street, right? Which is something we want there. One thing, and we have had, at least to date, a little bit of the oddities with the lots that Minko's used in a way. These lots going on Parker Street might be a little bit more quote unquote regular in some ways. But like the Haley site's a very unusual kind of, configuration, right? Very tight and narrow. And in the case of the Boston Way sites, because of the National Grid easement going through there and the 50-foot, just, you can't do anything in this area that's going to, anything with the building that was going to constrain there a little bit awkwardly too. But I think, the one thing that isn't addressed is the proportion of that frontage that is, covered with that building.
Yeah.
So if you've only got like a short segment of building on each lot, right? But if we're able to improve the 40R districts by, adding some specificity to that, you won't have this like long gaps between, the continuity of the district, right, of a neighborhood. So, yeah.
So let's keep going here.
And sorry, one last question on Andy's point there. So can you remind me, One Boston Way, for example, what is the parking ratio to units, to residential units?
I don't recall off the top of my head, but I know that there are a few spaces over what the ordinance requires.
But it's the ordinance is based on the bedroom size, right?
It is, yeah.
It might be something like 1.3 or 1.4.
Yeah, it's like 1.2, 1.3. I think it's more like 1.3.
1.3.
Yeah, 1.3 about. Remember, each of these projects is a slight variation, so I recall exactly the ratio on the top of my head for each of them because they were a slight variation off of the default in 40R plus, a variation of a few spaces. Usually developer oftentimes wants a few more spaces than the ordinance actually requires. So,
well, I ask it because if you're thinking of increasing the density, right, then you need to have the available room for the parking for each of these parcels.
Yeah.
Right. And the state does, I mean, at least for the calculation purposes, the state does put, in their algorithm, some basic assumptions about this place, the space that parking would to displace. So.
But that's a really good point, Charlie, because the state's calculations, as I understand it, are based on providing all of the parking with surface parking.
That's right.
And One Boston Way and all of these Minko projects have parking under the building.
That's right.
So they're getting more density than the state would say they could get.
That's right.
That site.
Yeah. The state's not giving us credit for all the
Right.
density they
So
might be getting.
I think that there's we could probably get a lot more density than the state is saying if we assume that parking is going to be placed below the building.
Right.
I actually didn't know they had parking below there. Interesting.
Yeah.
But that's not an option with MBTA.
The state, well, even if you were to say this site's directly across the street and the wetlands are about the same distance away and the same topography, there's no allowance here for us to try to make the case for that. We have to basically assume it's all surface parking because again, they have to do a broad brush regional approach. So they just have to kind of have uniformity, which may in this case not give us as much credit, but we could anticipate some different things happening here at the site,
Well, it gives flexibility to a developer is what I'm suggesting, I guess. Or asking.
Yeah. So go ahead. So this is my nightmare scenario. Yeah. Having 5 more Minko projects, right? With the same kind of orientation, 10 feet from the street. And these parcels are longer, deeper than they are wide. So this is probably an efficient way to do it. But
Are those crop rectangles?
what's that?
Are those crop rectangles?
Yeah, exactly. So, but I think this is the one thing I would like to make sure our zoning doesn't allow. That we want to discourage this type of development.
Incidentally, just coincidentally, when we first started, I don't want to say first started, but years ago when we were talking with NED, maybe around 2016, 2017, the first plan that we saw from them for the Waterfront West area was the same configuration of these buildings, just all the same parallel rectangles like this, which, even worse to put in the downtown, than even here, but yes.
But this doesn't create any kind of sense of community.
Right, there's no sense of neighborhood here, right, or streetscape, so, yeah.
So go ahead. So here's what we have right now. So on One Boston Way, it kind of works because the Parker Street is kind of at an angle. It's not a right angle, Parker and Boston Way. So you get some more lawn in front of it, which adds to it. If the whole thing were 10 feet from the street line, it might be kind of oppressive. And also because you have another street there, which you sort of, even though it's the back of the building, it sort of gives the sense of having the building giving the streetscape, having a streetscape.
Is that street, Minko Street?
No, it's a public street.
That's
It's a public street, yeah. And in this case, I think it's important to note that as I mentioned before, this is probably a place where there was a waiver because they could not put the building 10 feet from Boston Way because of the drainage.
Mhm.
That's my understanding. They need to have this stormwater system, something like that.
Yeah.
So it's actually set further back than the zoning would require. So it's, I think it's something to think about. It's a 4-story building. We may be looking more at 3-story buildings going down Parker Street, but we'll see about that. Okay, go ahead, pick another one. So I started looking around the web, trying to find examples of, buildings that kind of hugged the street or, had their major face toward the street. This happens to be a senior housing building out in Illinois. It looked like it was perhaps 20 feet back from the street when we figured in the entrances and everything. Maybe even a little bit more. Again, it has a feeling of being more pedestrian oriented. Another one. This is 3-story multifamily. Probably not the kind of design that would happen here, but it's probably 20 feet back from the edge of the street. If the edge of the street is the back of the sidewalk.
If you had to guess, what would you say the density of that would equate to? Because that does seem like it could fit on 1 or 2 of those parcels.
Yeah.
That to me looks like the 30 units per acre range.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering too. And that does feel neighborhoody, right? So you have a very substantial building over by Metzi's, right? And then you walk around the corner and then you feel like you're walking down, neighborhood.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Okay, another one. This is actually one in Portsmouth that interestingly was added to a shopping center. Yes, that's on Constitution Avenue in Portsmouth, and it was the back parking for a dollar store or some kind of store that used to be there, and they took down this kind of low, almost a wholesale type of store, and built this residential building in it. And take another view. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I had a question or a comment. So are we also going to be including the possibility of having mixed use?
Yes.
Okay, because that's actually a great idea. So it could feel impersonal, except for you have some activity down below based on, retail, coffee shop, restaurant, or whatever, which is another consideration if you're trying to build a neighborhood, right? And especially if you're out a little further than downtown, I think people would gravitate towards that. So maybe something to consider.
Yeah. And start building a neighborhood, right? Go ahead, Andy. So this is the aerial view of that building. So this is where we started looking at these buildings that have this L shape to them, that hug 2 frontages and also have their parking tucked behind. Yes, and you can see it's actually very close to Constitution Avenue, to the street, but definitely not. It could be 20 feet, something like that. Go ahead. This is another one in Portsmouth. I couldn't get a current photo, and I didn't have time to go up and take a picture. This is a development in Portsmouth called West End Yards, in an old industrial area. And again, you can see the buildings are kind of using that L shape to get a major frontage along the street, and then use that to tuck the parking behind. Another next picture. And that's what it looks like from the air. So I think we can perhaps think about this kind of approach for Barker Street. Next one. Ryan, you may know about this one. I didn't know about it. I used to work here, but this has happened since I used to work here on Mount Wade Avenue in Framingham. It's called the Buckley Apartments, and it's obviously very close to the edge of the street. There's a grade change there, so the building is kind of in the foreground. The building is below grade. Down by the driveway is at grade.
See a bike lane though.
The bike lane, yeah. Next picture. Another view of it from down below. And again, it's one of these, then take the next picture. And you can see, again, it's getting kind of repetitive, but it's this kind of L shape that helps you create some enclosure within the site, and also give you a long wall along the street to give you some sense of place there. And then we have the next Minko project, which is got the same type of close to the street. I think we gave some waivers there. I can't remember in terms of
Yeah.
setbacks.
Yeah, a few.
But this is, we might have more of this. And I'd rather have more of this kind of development than more of one Boston Way. Just thinking of having something that really helps define the street.
I like that one.
Next question. Did somebody say something?
I just said, I like that. That's nice.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking about just in terms of some basic street design objectives. I'd like to define the street edge, have some appropriate minimum and maximum setbacks. Trying to get long facades parallel to the street, with parking setback behind the buildings to the extent possible. Landscaping is part of the frontage. And then the other part of it is extending the multi-use path on the south side of Parker Street from Boston Way to Grant Road, and creating a sidewalk on the north side, so there's adequate pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure on the street. Yeah, Andy.
One note, and it may be more so, unfortunately, for you and I to spend time on after this meeting, but because of the question that Jamie had asked about what we know there's a
Yeah.
potential impact on unit capacity. That based on the timeframes, what you and I would probably want to do is circle back with the MVPC.
Yeah.
And because we've had some dialogue with the state about how they would adjust for some of the particulars in our 40R district to account for some of these things. We would, I think, for one or two of these, we might want to check with Ian and potentially with the OHLC, so we can quickly, quickly in a matter of weeks, determine the proportion of impact, and that way we can zone in on, so to speak, the 30 to 40
Well,
unit ratio, right? To offset it while still achieving these design standards that we think are important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Next one. So going from this, my nightmare scenario, go to the next one. So I'm not a very good draftsman. But this is what I was thinking, we could start thinking about something like this, or as Bob suggested yesterday, in the side conversation, perhaps providing lots, right? Again.
It's a question.
Yeah.
I think we'd hope as well. I mean, part of it would depend on the private sector, but you'd hope that a few of these would be cobbled together to make a more coherent overall plan, right? Yeah.
That's exactly what I was thinking, Andy, that, there's a possibility that these could merge or have one developer.
Right,
gobble
which
up.
provides more opportunity, or we could configure them that way.
Yeah, yeah.
So-
But those, those aren't bad options either.
So in this case, what I've done, is I've moved the buildings at least the buildings on I think all of them, at least up to about 20 feet back from the street line rather than 10 feet. And, I'd added the 10-foot, shared use path on the south side of Parker Street, and a 5-foot sidewalk with a green space on the north side of Parker Street, for that one lot. And, so zoom in a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I would know that, by the way, regardless of what we do with anything related to, because I think we need to bolster and do more, at the end of the day, the 40R district is already expecting the developer to put in, minimum sort of sidewalk, frontage and so forth. But here we have the ability to bolster that with more improvements, right?
So the next slide, so zooming in here, so you can see, this is obviously not scientific, but it's, we're beginning to see, and I don't know why I put a driveway in the middle of that building, but,
It's gonna be relocated.
Yeah.
That's it, yeah.
so you can see that that multi-use path, there's actually enough right of way in the street for everything we want, but the paved street is off center in the right of way. So where we want the right of way, the shared use path on the south side, there's not enough room for it. Without moving the road, and I don't think we can expect developers to move the road. So I'm just sort of showing that if we have the buildings 20 feet back from the lot line, we still have room for that 10-foot shared use path that partially intrudes into lots. We didn't have to use some easements or something like that. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a quick question on that, totally in favor of the effort here, the plan. The question I just had was, I don't recall off the top of my head, when talking with public services about the record plans we have for the layout of the right of way and the infrastructure improvements. I'm just wondering if we're referencing this alignment, this, center line offset, let's say, between the right of way, whether that's from the GIS maps here, or whether we have also, like DPS has also said, yeah, our plans show that the I'm just wondering whether or not, like, in reality, if we were to basically take our survey plans out there on the hopes that we might actually have more right of way there than say the assessor's maps are here showing, right? You know, that I think we have to rely on like more leverage during the permitting process to use the frontage of properties as they're going. But at the end of the day, hopefully the right of way plan will show that there's at least a little bit more room to work with. I just want to flag that as something that, because I haven't walked through that with public services, that detail.
Yeah, I didn't want to go through that level of detail.
Yeah.
Just wanted to get a sense of how much room do we need to get these sidewalks and paths in there, and is it feasible?
And this is the side of the street here already that connects to Route 1 and with the Mass DOT's putting the crossing in right now, there is in, so.
In the dimensional strength from the growth back to the base, is there room for kind of planting edge and street trees?
So, yeah, so, well, that's, I mean.
Depends on how
that's
much.
Exactly what we want to talk about. Yeah. So I had left, I actually may have a slide about it, but I had assumed, just maybe a 3 or 4 foot planting strip between the sidewalk or multi-use path and the street, but certainly we could, we could expand it.
I couldn't quite hear what Bob said, sorry.
Talking about the width, how much room is there in this plan for a planting strip, the landscape strip between
Gotcha.
the multi-use path and the street?
Okay, thank you.
Have street trees.
Or street trees, yes,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
And the other question I have, and if you could zoom out just a little bit.
This is out all the way on
Go
this
to-
one.
go to the next
You mean,
one.
yeah.
The reason I was asking about that street next to. I was wondering if you could use that as a point of access to these 3 new parcels and bring the cars in on the backside.
They could, but only if they use this lot here. So it wouldn't be permitted on these other lots back
Right,
here,
right.
but they could definitely do it here.
It's kind of back to combining parcels again, problems with that. But, you know, is there a way of avoiding all the curb cuts on the Parker Street and room traffic? And maybe it's a loop and it does come out, you know, like go back to that end or something.
Yeah.
But getting all the traffic behind the building so that you can treat those facades.
Right.
I really like that idea. If, I mean, it depends a little bit on the private sector for the lot configuration, but I definitely like that idea.
And we could, think about, maybe there is some incentives we put in the zoning to make that more attractive.
Yeah.
Next one. Okay, so right now, these are some key standards we have. We've got a minimum lot area of 10,000 square feet, minimum length of frontage of 40 feet. No requirement for a minimum setback, but 10-foot maximum setback. And no requirement for side yards and a 10-foot rear yard setback. So these are some of the dimensional standards we might want to think about playing with as we think about what makes sense for Parker Street, which I think is very different from the Boston Way lots or the Route 1. It's just totally different. We're going to be changing the character of the district, however we do it. So we need to be careful with this. So the next slide. So in Melrose, your smart growth district has a maximum of 20 feet back. But it can be increased to 30 feet, provided that the additional yard area incorporates this courtyard and sitting area, and it's at least 20 feet deep. So a really substantial, meaningful sitting area that is a public use area. So that, looking at that as some flexibility there. And then at least 60% of the front side of a lot facing public street shall be occupied by buildings or open space. So this is to get away from having, and I think that language probably needs to be refined more, because I can think about ways that could be, you could not get what you're trying to get under that. But that idea of saying you want to have at least a certain percentage of the lot that's at least building. Right, maximize that. Okay, next one. In Portsmouth, there used to be this is no longer applicable, but this is really what that Portsmouth building that I showed you, those 2 Portsmouth developments were using These regulations have changed since then. But, the street frontage has to be bigger, 100 feet rather than 40, which I think is probably makes sense for the scale of development. That it has, again, 60% of the lot frontage has to be occupied by village open space. It's interesting that these two completely different communities have exactly the same word where it comes from. And then variable setbacks depending on the size of the street, the scale and function of the street. We'll go to the next slide. And so here's where I was thinking about the kinds of things I was thinking. Increasing the maximum front setback, which I'm talking about quite a bit. Requiring provision for the 10-foot multi-use path and 3-foot buffer on the south side. And then say that will likely intrude in lots and say these two provisions will slightly reduce the allowable building envelope and thereby may reduce the unit capacity calculations. And just talking about what I mentioned in terms of the right of way. Yeah.
Just a quick question, whether or not you were contemplating here the idea that this, so I guess to what extent would this be attempted to insert or modify the existing 40R areas versus only the new sub area being added?
I'm thinking about this new subject.
Okay, that's what I was assuming as well.
I
Okay.
don't think, again, I think Parker Street is so different from State Street.
I agree. I think, you might want that so that compact, like the buildings are close, more like a downtown, closer to Route 1, but then further away, you want, right, with Parker's a different street.
And
So,
we're gonna
okay,
get bigger scale buildings on Parker Street than we're gonna get. on State
Agreed.
Street.
okay,
So I think
thank you.
I think that's really, so what I'm really thinking about here is how do we begin to use zoning to plan, and maybe it's actually the opposite way. How should we plan for Parker Street and what zoning changes do we need to do to make that happen, like in project? So, that's where I've gotten so far.
Sorry, I was just, maybe I missed a little bit of this, but what was the reasoning again for reducing the setback? If we're trying to make sure they have the ability to build the density that we need in the buildings?
I'm saying increase the setback from 10, increase the maximum setback from 10 to 20 to make room for, well, partially to make room for the pedestrian infrastructure and landscaping that we want to have in front, but also in recognition of the fact that these are taller buildings, likely to be taller buildings, and just and I may be wrong about this, but my sense that if we had 3- and 4-story buildings 10 feet back from Parker Street on both sides, it might start to feel oppressive. So I just want to make it a little bit, make the streetscape a little bit softer while still allowing the density that we're trying to get. And
Do the setbacks, you showed us that one image of those townhouses, that row of townhouses. Do the setbacks include the stair, like they had those stairs that go down? Or is it just to the foundation? I forget.
Which one was
That one, sorry.
Sorry, this
Yeah.
one,
Nope, one back.
this one.
There, yeah, that one. So see that?
Yeah, so that would be to the building wall,
What's that?
to the building wall. the
Okay.
wall.
Okay, because that's probably what, a 20-foot
This is
setback
exclusive,
there.
so, yeah.
Actually, maybe more than 20.
So I don't know, I'm just thinking, how long are those treads on the stairs? They're probably 2.5 feet, something like that, 2 feet. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. It might be, yeah, it might be 15 feet.
Yeah.
So,
So I guess what I'm saying is that you'd be, I guess, encouraging that type of building.
yeah. Encouraging that build, that type of setback, right,
Yeah.
Probably more than 20 feet.
right, more than 20 feet.
Right, because you got the sidewalk and then the
Where
trees.
the lot line is across.
Yeah.
But for the back of the
And the
sidewalk,
back of the sidewalk, it's more than 20 feet. Okay,
yeah.
you're better at this than I am.
No, I like what I'm just trying to follow the reasoning, that's all. I
So
like it.
in this case, obviously, it's a 3-story building, but one half is halfway below grade, but then the whole grade is raised, so.
Yeah, we wouldn't have any raised grading here, really. Either side would be roughly,
Yeah.
level with the street. We're not gonna have that situation.
I mean, I think that makes sense too, as you go farther from the station. Obviously, the cars speed up, and that's part of it, is the
Yeah.
speed of the cars,
Right.
really, practically.
And you're kind of moving away from the density of the core, which is basically around the train station and Route 1 traffic circle, right? So you're moving away from it. It gets a little bit more dispersed. sense of more space. You're entering the business park, which does have a lot of more
It's a
expansive
transitional area.
transitional corridor,
You can
yeah.
almost see it, I mean, the design might coordinate, but 15 feet, then 20, then 20, like
Yeah.
telescoping is farther you get away, but
Right.
that's too, we're not gonna
Yeah.
go there probably, but.
And we only have 3 lots.
Yeah.
So it's,
But that would be, if someone was really sensitively designing it, they
Yeah.
might
right,
pose something like that,
Yeah.
right?
I think the proportion of the buildings is definitely relevant as the issue, and I think it's relevant for us everywhere. In this particular instance, I am more concerned and more in favor of the added distance, mainly because I want to see that bike path connection and enough space to make sure that that can happen, in this case, properly on the south side. So to me, although there's different reasons for, to me, the heavier weight I apply is the ability to allow us to make sure that that happens. More so than I'm sort of concerned, even though at the end of the day, I definitely agree with conceptually the idea. I'm not as bothered by the buildings being as close. Obviously, I'm comfortable with the downtown, which has 0 lot line setbacks, but as you pointed out, depending on whether they're 30 units an acre or 40 units an acre, 3-story, 4-story, depending on that scale and making a transition, I think it can both help to make the transition. But to me, the most important thing is being able to make sure we provide enough space and we work together with each property, or development to have that extension of the connectivity. So.
Is it?
So I like Jamie's comment on that, the telescoping out, right? As you go further into the, let's just say suburban.
Well, that's Rick's idea. I'm just saying I agree. So
Yeah.
thank you.
We're planning, right? This is long-term planning.
But could it be as simple as trying to figure out like how much you can afford to lose units? Because you're gonna lose some units as you pull it back. It just,
Yeah, I mean, we're just
Since-
estimating that proportionally it won't be enough to trip the threshold where we're still within the 30 to 40 unit acre option we've talked about. So it's still roughly palatable as far as we can tell to the discussion that we've had with counselors to date. It still seems palatable at
and
least.
I think that if we, again, I think that we could actually go to, for that first lot, we could actually stick at 40, because
right,
the 40 is right across the.
Right across the
Right.
street,
Yeah.
right?
yeah.
Yeah, and my assumption was we look at if it's one property or does it have to be two, but it's basically starting with the one, and if that gets us to the threshold, we're done. If not, we go to the next one.
And to Bob's point, that one lot, if it got developed on its own, which hopefully there would be some consolidation, but it could come off of Boston Way, whereas the others would be more, they'd be different. They need to be different.
And you have to think that they have to be economically viable as well, right? So that has to be part of the consideration.
I'm sorry, what did you say, John?
We have to consider, of course, whether or not they're economically viable to build.
They'll be able to.
30 units per acre is not
Yeah.
viable.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
L, portion of the L that runs parallel to the parking could be 3-story. So you've got that scale working.
Yeah.
And then it could actually get to 4 stories, away from the street.
Yeah.
So I think, are you looking for feedback yet?
Yes, I am, yeah.
I think it's awesome. I think I hadn't thought of that potential. The fact that you thought of that, I think it's great.
What, the L's?
Yeah, I hadn't. I mean, I think there's some market pressure for people to design things that look nice.
Yeah.
So I don't think they would all get developed that way, but even 2 of them might be weird, so I think it's great. Why did you not think the percentage build out would work? You said you had hesitate on that you wrote
Sorry,
that
which slide?
60% of the frontage must be built out, but you were worried that wasn't gonna work, because I
Oh,
thought.
no, I wasn't worried it wasn't gonna work. I was just commenting on the fact that both Portsmouth and Melrose have exactly the same words in the
Oh.
ordinances.
Oh, okay.
It's like this planning ether that everybody's sharing.
But eyeballing it, that's about how you drew it.
Yeah.
And it also makes it have to be a turn, because those are 60-foot wide buildings, and that's what multifamily buildings are.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
And so they already will have to make a turn, so you've made them force the issue that they have to make some sort of L, and that makes them just think more about, okay, well, what that L is. I think you've already, I think it's great. I think
What
it's
do you mean it has to make a turn?
Well,
That's the
To-
typical width of the bay,
to
the
get
two
that much
units
frontage,
with
the
the hallway.
corridor inside the multifamily building will have to turn.
Yes, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now, once you've made them do that, they're gonna think, oh, why are we doing this? And
Yeah.
let's make it, so you're enforcing a certain
Yeah.
design thinking, which I think is fantastic.
I think it might help to we already have illustrations in the smart growth zone of things.
Yeah.
We may want to have some illustrations of examples of buildings that have done this.
Yeah.
You know, say, here are some ways you can deal with this.
Yeah. Yeah, the strength comes from the text of the ordinance and what the guideline actually says, or that the board uses. But the detail helps with that to illustrate it and to help to bolster, as the board saying to an applicant, this doesn't quite meet that standard, this is what we're talking about. So,
Go back to that one with the buildings are set back up.
oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So, you had mentioned street trees and so forth.
Yeah.
What kind of, planting strip or tree strip, what kind of dimension would we really ideally want?
In the range of say 8 feet.
Oh,
I don't think it needs to be a lot.
so, because this is probably 4 feet. Okay, so that adds a little bit more, so we have that, so. That would actually give, if we had a really nice tree planting plan, I think this into a nice avenue.
If you look, I mean, it's a totally different environment, but if you look at city of Boston standards these days, like down in the Seaport, there's a planting strip along the street, which generally has more of a kind of cobblestone paving and intermittent tree grades and trees. And then they now are pushing, for maintenance reasons, they're pushing for concrete sidewalks. So they're plowable and they're not dealing with bricks and everything. So, but they get the texture of that in the planting strip. And just not that you would do that here, but I'm just thinking dimensionally. If I remember correctly, those are probably a little bit less than what we're talking about, but this kind of the idea, the proportions are kind of right. So I would say in a situation like this, kind of 8 feet gives you plenty of room for a reasonable tree and some ground cover and whatever. And that's I think all you need. It's the trees are what's and these units, by the way, in the photo are very bright. Look at what's happened.
Stone over wood.
It's a you raise up to a door. And so it's down a half level. So why does the ground slope?
We can't get away from the oddities in this building while we're talking about
Bob
this.
and I
space.
Right.
Yeah.
could be merciless. On
I think
this.
the conversation about the architectural details on this building is another whole conversation, an essay in itself, but yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, it's quite a variety of colors.
But the relationship to the street was what you were trying
Yes,
to do.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You use what you can get.
Yeah.
Any other ideas for this? Anything else we can be working on?
The only thing I was gonna say, just in terms of like getting as much feedback as possible on this is the time frame. If we're trying to roll obviously this into prior to submitting to the state, so we know where this impacts the unit count, and then we can go back into the exercise back into the lots to verify, is it just the first lot that has to be 40 units an acre and then the others taper down or whatnot. We would ideally want to, in the next couple of weeks, hone in on what that might be. Otherwise, we won't have time to run it through the model, send it over to the state, get their confirmation in terms of the unit count and so forth. Not that at the end of the day, it may not be feasible to still incorporate things, but it's a lot easier if we're able to run by designs. Not some of these might not have any bearing, but some of these design standards, like the spatial ones, have some bearing on how the state does unit capacity calculations. So because they've effectively had to do that adjustment on the fly, they literally have a conversation with us and explain, make an adjustment like this to it. It's not because they have to do a million different variations for communities that the rigid model doesn't account for. The sooner we know what these parameters are actually going to be in the ordinance, the clearer we can be with EOHLC about the actual numerical impact on the unit capacity, as opposed to sort of a vague notion of what it might be. Ian and I from MVPC met with the state the other, week or two ago. And we went through some of those parameters that we were contemplating, as well as the existing 40R. But here, where we have a new one, obviously, the sooner we are able to run that through the model and verify with them how they would be treating it, we can verify that they will actually get the same number at the end of the day. They're not going to be disputing with us, where our unit capacity comes out.
So if there's a
Well-
date, you could go slightly under by this increased frontage. There's no doubt that adding that one lot at 40 units per acre would more than compensate.
Right, presumably that's the case. And
Oh,
right,
there's no doubt,
yeah.
Unless there's something really weird about the algorithm.
Agreed, yeah, and that's one good reason why I think we verified, at least with the zoning advisory group, maybe not the council yet, but at least with the members of the zoning advisory group, which includes counselors, the idea that there was already a level of comfortable, everybody was comfortable with the idea that if we had to go up to 40 units an acre there, that was reasonable to, have a buffer and to be able to get to that unit capacity with the state, should there be any
So
differential
there's
on any
already
of these.
consensus on.
Well, again, not the full 11-member council, but at least with the zoning advisory group and the 5 members we had there was general consensus that it made sense to have that discussion and to agree upon that, recognizing that we would want to be on the same page if we ran into, because the 30 unit per acre scenario was very tight against that capacity. So we wanted to make sure that at the end of the day, everybody had also conceptually agreed that if we had to go up to 40 units an acre on one of the lots or more, that we were already prepared for that. So is that accurate? Is that, yeah.
So, I'm now realizing that I've said something a little bit misleading. So when I've been talking about this, I've been saying, let's move the maximum front yard setback from 10 feet to 20 feet. We're really almost talking about a build-to line at 20 feet. It's not a minimum or a maximum. It's saying, let's establish a street line. So maybe that's
That also encourages more consistency, but
Yeah.
frontage to frontage when they don't combine the lots together, on their own. So I like that idea of having uniformity in that way. You're hesitant.
What do you think?
I don't know, except you get 4 buildings in a row.
Well, maybe we're talking
That's a
about.
little too much,
yeah.
right? So how do you balance
So
that?
maybe we're talking about but maybe it's not a maximum 20, but maybe it's a build to line of 25. give or
To like a
take-
range,
give or take
yeah,
5
maybe we give a
units or
range for the
something
build
like that.
to, so the build to has some consistency
Yeah.
or,
So
yeah.
you can jog a little bit, but
Can we go back to that slide that shows the buildings on the parcels? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I articulation, I think is good word, because in a situation like this, the primary line might be there, but this is not a location for just flat facades.
Oh, yeah,
So-
yeah,
Right.
yeah. We're assuming there's already articulation of variation on
Yeah.
the facade as part of that design. Yeah, yeah.
so
They may even step back, right? On the second level or the third level.
it could be, I think, well, it does, for a 3-level building, I'm not even sure you need to do that.
But for 3.
Yeah,
So that could,
Or balconies, any number of features.
what were you saying, John?
I said, or balconies or any number of features.
Right,
do we even discuss retail? in this?
we allow
We allow it as a use. We already, with the smart growth district, allow the multifamily residential as a standalone use. The main thing that we really focused on when we were working with Minko thus far was to try to make sure like first floor ceiling heights were a little taller.
Right.
And we tried to get like live work units, and then on the Haley site, we got that totally standalone commercial space.
Yeah, I was gonna mention live work also.
Oh, yeah.
Those kinds of things which might give. you,
Activate, yeah,
Ground level activation of
yeah.
that.
we're not able to mandate.
You can't mandate, but. we
Right,
can- we
right.
can-
Mandate design.
Right, and that's the thing we were trying to by design.
You know, that's what
It,
Minko got hung up on. They had to provide it because it was a requirement.
no, effectively what we were doing was we were encouraging them to prep it for the future to make sure that could happen here. We had that whole discussion. Well, it's not going to be viable because there's not enough residents and a gravity of people, to support the business right in that location. But you can think like Metsy's is going to get enough business with everybody kind of building up around there, right? So we basically tried to make sure that they had the right ceiling heights, a little more space for, things like that, HVAC or whatever, but and a unique, thing like a restaurant or a cafe or, retail. But we also tried to have like glass and transparency as best as we could facing the public way. It would be a good thing to have here, continuity of that, I think, as well, along Parker Street, as opposed to the back residential units. It's maybe the front, face of a building or a facade or, So I think I think it'd be good for us to try to encourage the same, even though we can't really mandate the use itself.
You know, this may not have any place for, this may not be part of the conversation, but I always like street lamps along, you know, the sidewalks. I feel like it encourages walking and people, you know, being able to see at night and, you know, a lot more activity. I don't know if that's something that's part of our planning or if that's just part of the design per building.
That's the per building site, you know, design review. Yeah, I mean, if there's a specific standard, that's the question we want to plug in here. But at the end of the day, that's definitely part of your
So
review.
what happened with Boston Way? Did we have, they must have sight lighting there through the parking lots and pathways, right?
Yeah, I don't recall. It wasn't an area of focus discussion. I remember standing out like significantly in one way or another, but there was definitely discussion about the type of lighting fixtures
But it
and
could be
that was going to work
the
out.
kind of thing that if we're trying to create a new character for this area,
Mhm.
on Parker Street, you may want to be talking with, if it's going to go along the street trees. So we may want to be talking about, you know, lower streetlights
Ah.
and more pedestrian scale type.
Yeah, yeah,
Rather than.
yeah.
what was-
Yeah, we could definitely, we could do specification, right? You know, along the frontage or the, you know, the public bikeways or sidewalks, that's what we want. We wouldn't be able to take out the, I don't remember exactly how it's lined up there, but like, you know, there's some lighting fixtures on telephone poles and I don't know. There's a few other things like that might be variations, but we could encourage here where they're doing improvements. We want the pedestrian scale at the bike path, at the sidewalks, right? That kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah, because you're gonna be accessing the bike path, right? And the walking path, the rail trail.
Yeah.
Often.
Exactly.
Yeah, I actually, although we haven't gotten there yet because the park's not finished yet, but with the new simulated historic, the old historic fixtures we have downtown are not technically historic themselves, but they're replications of historic, right? And so we're now replacing them with LED model lights that are not the exact same of the old fixture, but they're close, you know, approximations of it. And they're a lot easier to maintain than the models that we had before. So at any rate, I mentioned this here only because in the waterfront park, which in say like a month to 6 weeks from now, we'll be able to open up, you'll be able to walk through. The bike path going through there has a similar sort of setup with the ornamental light posts on either side. And I think you get a similar sense of like, this is what that bike path could be, you know, here on Parker Street with the ornamental fixtures kind of lining that and providing a sense of continuity to the connection. Even if these properties are developed individually, there's a sense of continuity of the bike path itself, if you will, if we were to do something similar here. Yeah.
Yeah, we should try to. I'm not sure whether we can lay that on the developer or whether that's something the city needs to have somebody come in and do a mini plan for the street to come up with a standard for the street.
Yeah, because somebody has to maintain the lights, right? And the fixtures.
Yeah.
All right, sorry, didn't mean to
Oh, no,
distract us.
Good points. Feel good about the way we're going? Any other ideas or anything we missed? So I mean, obviously, we've missed a lot. So it'll only come up when we actually look at the text. But, anything that, you know, any ideas you have, please feel free.
You did a good job, Rick.
Yeah, I think it's great. I'm glad you thought of that potential problem
Okay.
before we came.
Anything else? No.
No, I think we'll circle back right after the planning development committee meeting and figure out, you know, where the council's going there, and that'll hopefully provide a path forward with the MBTA, and then we can also focus on other areas from there as that kind of plows ahead with a more formality to the state. We can then focus on other areas because that'll be kind of moving along. So.
How much detail do you need to take to the state? You know, by the way, did you know that Newbury passed their zoning last night?
Yeah.
A year ahead of schedule?
Yeah, Ian went there from our Housing Trust meeting, actually. So, yeah.
Good. That was exciting. But what do we need to have done?
I think the main thing here that's a time constraint only so that because we have to provide enough time with working with Ian to run it through the model.
Right.
And specifically here to, depending on the number, if it's going to be 20 feet, right?
Yeah.
We have to run that by UHLC just to make sure how they would want us to offset that in the model, because the model doesn't count for all these little details that we might have in local zoning. So I think what we would want to do is just verify how that might impact the unit capacity at the end of the day. They might use some other, method within the model that works conveniently for the state to, evaluate it as a reasonable offset of that essentially. So-
So do they, I'm actually unclear on this. I know that Ian runs it through a model.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does the state also do a separate run through model?
No, I think effectively they're going to look at the same model, but what happens is, so like if they look at the text of the ordinance and they see the 10,000 square foot limitation we have on building footprint, for instance, which is the one that we were focused on initially in the discussion with the state. The question was, are they going to, as they have been doing in some of the other communities, because they're doing a ton of communities, right, simultaneously, and they all have different provisions. And the model's only accounting for the big chunks of it. It's not accounting for the little fine grained things like, these types of things we're talking about here. So they look at that and they say, all right, even though your model is run through technically, correct through the modeling system here, we can't ignore the text in your ordinance that's going to limit the way that the buildings could be configured on the site, because they're assuming every site's developed with the maximum extent of buildings out to the envelope, right? So they say, all right, this is reasonably going to impact that. There isn't, unfortunately, there's not no clear specificity in the guidelines, and I don't know that they really could do it because every situation is different, but in the time frame they had, but their guidelines don't specifically say in an instance like our 10,000 square foot building limitation, how they're going to address that. So we had an informal consult with them and they came back and they said, we're going to try to make the case actually that it's going to not have an impact or minimally have an impact. But they also said at the end of the day, one thing they might do is essentially say, all right, we want you to just use like an open space and a slight increase in the open space calculation for the lots in order to provide like a reasonable offset, so to speak, like you add 2-3% of that or 5% of that to the original open space assumption. And that would be like an offset, so to speak. It's clearly an approximation. It's broad brush. It's not taking into account every site clearly, but they wanted to not ignore provisions in local zoning that are text-based, like this, that could still reasonably impact the unit capacity. So in this case, I say that only because the guidelines don't specifically call it out now. And of course, getting their bandwidth and, and so forth is an issue. We have to nail down a time with them. It's a week later. We get a time with them to consult. They're able to confirm. We can then verify what the number is, but we have to know because it's not dictated directly by the guidelines. It's partly their interpretation of little oddities like this, how that is then run through the model. So it's the same model spreadsheet, but they will basically go back in there probably and say something like increase the open space, number here, not from what the 40R district says, but slight offset of that in order to essentially, like provide a penalty that offsets the, the increased demand you're putting on a developer that's going to impact their unit capacity by moving the buffer back, the front setback back. So I just say that it's a little bit on the fly, which is why in order for us to get a number, that we know the state's going to be, we're not going to have the state come out with a completely different place on this, so to speak, is that we're able to run that informally by them because there is no formal way of checking that other than having an informal conversation right now. So
is that Boston Way, is that subject to the 10,000?
That was increased actually. So there's a higher threshold, I think it's 22,000 square feet right in the corridor. So there are a couple of things that were going on. One, there was discussion of whether or not waivers, would be granted or be appropriate. But in that instance, partly because of I think it was the National Grid piece in particular, where they were basically only left with the remaining portion of the property. They couldn't do like an L shape or anything. They had to do like a linear building. Anyway, there's back and forth with the planning board, but the end result was there was a modification that expanded the 10,000 square feet in that corridor only around the train station, that 250-foot corridor where they're in, to have it be allowed to go up to 22,000.
So what I'm wondering is whether we need to have a 10,000 square foot, whether we need to have a footprint limitation law on the building in this corridor. If we're specifying some specific designs, things like building face along the street, and then there's a parking requirement, and we've got a 30 unit per acre max. I wonder whether we even need.
I would be fine inserting a sentence that says this provision does not apply in the sub-district, whatever, sub-district C doesn't apply in and to me that would make sense, but
it just seems like another, you don't really need it.
Yeah.
and it might provide more flexibility for, working with the developer to get to the layouts we want, right?
Yeah. It seems arbitrary.
Yeah.
One lurking concern that may not be part of this discussion, but if we are proposing this kind of density in a concentrated area, there are infrastructure and utility impacts, there are traffic impacts on Parker Street. There may be intersection improvements that are required. I mean, if you're, peak traffic coming out of these residential buildings, heading towards Graff Road, there are impacts related to this kind of density in a concentrated area. I don't know how much we want to get into that discussion, but they're there.
Yeah, no, they're definitely there. I mean, to me, this one that Rick is talking about here, this frontage and the bike path and the walk, the walkways and so forth, the connectivity and all that, I think is to me, my lens is the primary one, mainly because the sewers, for instance, and only because I have some of the background in some of the other peer areas, but like the sewer lift station, the area has been upgraded, so that's an issue that's been addressed with the 40R district. Originally, we went for a mass works grant and so forth. So that's an area that, say, we don't necessarily need to focus on sewer, this is a connectivity issue for sure. Traffic, I just say in general is that there are definitely localized improvements we want them to do along their frontage, 100%. But I'm doubtful at the end of the day that it would result in anything like from a mitigation perspective, because that's still applicable. Mitigation of development impacts is not taken off the table with MBTA communities. There's still debate about little particulars, sort of like the case law side, but it's not precluded for us to basically say you're making an impact, you got to mitigate that. And chime in here if you want to, on that.
Well,
But
but wondering about, I was about to ask that question. What can we ask for? I mean, as long as it's as of right, as long as the development is as of right.
right.
And we're not having any discretion, then in terms of our ability to approve or.
Well, I would say, like, for
Sorry,
example,
what do you mean by, what are you asking for? Who
It-
are we asking?
if the developer, like this, Bob was saying, like this development and any development in general is putting impacts, right? And the question is, what are those impacts and are they mitigated, right? I mean, so one thing, for instance, is from a traffic perspective is, are there improvements that are going to be necessary in the immediate area, right?
Okay.
There are sewer.
I just wanted to understand it.
In this case, if there was there wasn't a capacity in the adjacent lift station for this area to pump the sewer to the sewer treatment plant, we would say you, the developer, have to put in a new sewer lift station or upgrade the existing one in order to have your development, have occupancy permits, because there's no way we're gonna, and so that happened with some of the permits, with Boston Way and with the Route 1 projects across the street, because we said you can't get your occupancy permits, you can do your permitting, but you can't get an occupancy until that thing's online. And so in this case, I see that as like sewer wouldn't necessarily be something we're tripping a threshold here where we could say, we have a reason to say you need to upgrade that system, right? It's there.
Okay.
But I think in the case of these improvements here, we definitely need them. And traffic, I think it's unlikely to be something in general other than along the frontage of the properties, because the likelihood of something tripping a threshold where it's going to totally change signals at, Graff Road and Parker, or
Right.
it's going to change Route 1 where they've just done improvements with this mass, and it's under Mass DOT jurisdiction and all that with the crossing. I'm doubtful that it's going to have an impact like that, or would be able to get into a real debate with somebody else that are doing significant improvements. But I think that these are the types of improvements that I think are obvious ones that we should leverage for the public, for the public side. But I guess I'm just saying, from a traffic perspective or sewer perspective, those are ones that don't to me don't seem like ones that are going to come up as things where you have to leverage something from, I guess is what I'm saying.
Traffic, we're potentially increasing the number of units by up to 340, 344. So it's not like we're adding 1,000. We're adding units, but I'm not sure that it's.
Yeah, I mean, like, would we reach a threshold where we could really say, and again, putting aside the Mass DOT side with they just done improvements, right? So on the other side of it, like, we'd have to trip a threshold in which we're saying that intersection at Parker Street and Graff Road just can't handle the traffic. And that's a threshold where I don't think we could reach that threshold with that intersection necessarily.
Well, isn't that the irony of this whole thing? That we're asked to increase the density of our housing close to the train or public transportation. So therefore less need for cars.
That's the idea. Yeah. Yeah,
So
theoretically.
maybe that shouldn't be such a factor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, something so
Something to think about.
I guess the next thing to do is to start drafting some language.
Yeah, I think you should draft the language, then we could simultaneously touch base with Ian and just kind of make sure that he's as quickly as possible from here, run it through the model.
Right.
And if we get any new ideas that are, coming up, we should throw that through quickly as well, so that we can, again, just to try to make sure that we don't get any last minute surprises from EOHLC when we're trying to get the unit capacity verification. Because this is a parameter that isn't in the 40R. So, well, Ian and I have talked with the state about the existing 40R provisions and how they apply here and how they might be sure or not. We haven't thrown in this one because this is a new tweak to that. So we'd want to just verify, to the extent it's going to impact the unit capacity. And then we would know more definitively for the city council, if not for you, whether or not it's just the first lot that has to be 40 units an acre, or is it, more than one lot or something like that to offset it.
So actually, going back to a question I asked earlier, I wasn't really clear. In terms of how much information we need, do we need to actually have a draft zoning ordinance in June?
They want, that's the thing that I wanted to flag here mainly, was that they do want to see that, again, it could be modified, tweaked from there, but they want to see those substantive provisions. And my concern is that if we throw in substantive provisions that could impact unit capacity enough that it trips below the threshold, and that's one reason why, Ian's, and I agree, is let's make sure we have a little bit of buffer regardless of where we come out. Let's have a few units over, because until the state does the full model review, they're doing a glancing review with us. They're estimating, they're telling us what they think they're going to do when they, how to run this through the model with an offset for something. But until we get the final sign off from them, we don't know definitively. So, again, at the end of the day, they do want to see the text portions of it. They want to see the map portion of it. They want to see, they're running through the whole thing. But, and it doesn't mean we can't add or tweak from there necessarily. It's just the problem is we might have an adverse impact on our unit capacity by adding a new design standard that has a spatial relationship on the unit capacity. At the end of the, if we do it too late in the game, we can't run it by the state. So that's all. It's just,
So the city council is going to come up with some decision on the 13th. The next meeting, the planning development on the 7th, city council meeting on the 13th, we meet on the 15th. So I think that probably I should do some more work on this to get a little bit more specific to feed to you and Ian. And then we can come back with another round.
Yeah.
Of this at our meeting the 15th.
And I'll leave it to you. I guess I'm not particularly worried about one or the other, only because we had that discussion about the unit capacity ratio and when our flexibility to go between 30 and 40, I don't know, do we need to get into this depth with the council? I mean, first, I think we need to focus them on the unit capacity first. And then we could move to this if if we're beyond that discussion, but it's worth them understanding this piece of it, because they're also looking at the zoning and gonna have to drop the final provisions. But I also, at the same time, I don't know that we need to insert that before we've had the discussion about the overall preference, because that would, I think, detract and steer away from it. So I'm thinking maybe after we've reached, that we can say, we want to make some tweaks to this. This goes along with the lines of between 30 and 40, allowing some buffer, and this is going to be a better design. But I'm just thinking,
So we let them come to their decision on the 13th.
I think I'm thinking as opposed to kind of confusing it with this, because this is a finer grain detail that may not actually impact their decision as far as unit capacity, right? And at that point, it's just informing a better design, set of design standards for the district in this area. Going with it, it doesn't impact the unit capacity and the preference for area location that this council's decided. So that we won't have to worry about it confusing people by getting off on a whole bunch of other parameters where we're right now need to focus on the unit capacity agreement first. Yeah. Okay.
So what do you think our next step? Do you think the next step is to start?
I think we start drafting the text that goes with this, and we simultaneously run that scenario, with Ian through the system and verify with UHLC, so that can inform the capacity. But I think we all assume that this all just marches along and seamlessly to the point where the text and, Ian's unit capacity calculation, and we're also putting together some narrative. It's gonna be the rationale as to why we, didn't penalize the city for a whole lot for the 10,000 square foot cap, it's one of those things. So they're gonna have that explanation going with it. So at any rate, I think we'll be in good order to be able to include that with what goes to the state, and then be able to circle back with the council. We can let them know that this, we think this should be included, it goes with it. And then that can come back to the council with confirmation from the state, both as far as unit capacity as well as the design standard to not be an adverse impact of any kind, and their blessing on that, so to speak. So, yeah.
Anything else from anybody?
My only question is, are we scuttling the consensus plan that we had that included the Enviropro, sorry, it's getting late.
So we're not scuttling it, but I think we're waiting for the city council. The city council has both of these options before them. And so
Okay.
we're waiting for them to say, because I think, the other thing, one reason that we came up with our proposal was there was concern about extending the housing too far into the business park. And I think there still may be some concern about that from some councils. So I think it's still very much on the table, but I don't think we should be spending a lot of time on that inflow site unless the city council decides that's the way to go.
Okay.
So, there's a boards meeting on May 9th. Um, I don't know, I think Alden and I did it last year. Where we just sit at a table. Yeah, I think Brian came. Brian came to our table, right, Brian? I don't know, for the board meeting last year,
City Hall Auditorium.
Oh, that's right.
that's where we met, I think.
Yeah, I think that was my first meeting, if that's what you're referring to.
No, that was where you met me, I think, at that table. You were going around the City Hall auditorium, going to different board tables.
Correct.
Yeah, right. So that's how we got Brian, so.
That's right.
Oh, right, right.
So it works, yeah.
That was the invitation we got. I forgot to respond.
Yeah, so, I'll be there. I don't think it's necessary for anybody unless anybody wants to. We just.
Yeah, I mean, they're looking for obviously volunteers from the boards to be there to, explain to others what the board does, invite them if they're interested in joining, give them some more background and so forth. And obviously, I think this is actually one of the first nights where they've had this where I don't have another meeting conflict now, I can actually go, so. But anyway, it's, yeah.
Anybody who would like to come, it's,
Rick was very persuasive on that night. He was on his A game.
6 to 7:30 on Thursday the night, if anybody wants to drop by. It's basically, as I said, basically just sitting at a table with a whole bunch of other committees and commissions and boards and talking to people about what we do.
I will be out of town. probably.
How convenient.
Let's just not lose someone to the liquor commission. Okay?
That sounds like so much more fun. I might want to go even there myself. Okay, anything else?
Think so, no. I've been noticing a million things in my head. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, I wish I had,
We have some
can't think at the moment.
small project on Boardman Street maybe coming up in the 14th.
Oh, yes, I'm not, I wasn't, yeah, that,
We don't have much on the agenda for the 15th.
Yeah. yeah.
Something,
Kind of fortuitous while we get through this really challenging matter.
yeah,
Oh, maybe it's worth noting on that in terms of the Story Avenue stuff. The Harvard Kennedy School folks did a presentation yesterday, and I'm hoping to get their final material so I can share that, with you guys. They did do a couple of renderings that I thought were interesting up with the Story Avenue area. As part of that, they did some financial analysis, and some economic feasibility analysis side of it as well. I'm still skeptical on the whole, percentage of affordability, what's economical and all that, but they did some analysis on that, so it's interesting. We'll be interested to see, those pieces. They were in essence coming out similar in terms of, where Ian, I don't know if Phil, you were part of the discussion, but Ian had mentioned that a lot of the communities who are looking at the ones that they're working with anyway, looking at the affordability are usually coming out between 10 and 15% for affordability, and not really getting to the 20% anyway with these EFAs. Or, where, and depending on whether we're doing the MPRO area, that we may have to have an EFA or not. But he's finding that, so the Harvard Kennedy School folks were kind of finding a similar thing, looking at sort of a developer's pro forma, kind of running it through and seeing, so you'll be able to, we're going to get the spreadsheet version from them, which I'm sure some of you may want to play around with. You can kind of toggle in and out numbers, like adjust the affordable housing percentage and see what it does to again, this is all based on some assumptions about developer pro formas as best as you can, but it's a pretty complicated, I think a good, spreadsheet that takes into account as many variables as they could, and it's kind of an interesting analysis of that. Again, depending on what you're, how much you think that you assume are accurate, but that's interesting. And then it's certainly the renderings I thought were actually good. They've only done a few handful, but they did do some good renderings. I thought that might be helpful, kind of as we kick off and have a discussion about that stuff. So anyway, I'll bring that to you once we get the final version from them. So
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, if there's nothing else, we can have our second vote of the evening, which is to adjourn. Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Second, okay. And unfortunately, we need a roll call again, so, Beth,
Yes.
Bob.
Yeah.
Jamie,
Yes.
Charlie,
Yes.
Ryan,
Yes.
Rick, yes. Okay. Thank you, everybody,
Okay.
for this. This is actually the fun part of being in the planning board, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was good. Thank you, Rick. That was great work. Seriously.
Thanks.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks. Good night.
Night.
Good night, guys.
Yeah, everybody.
Ciao.